Hi, hopefully it's okay
Hello.
now.
Okay. Hello. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Welcome to the Peat Symposium. We are just letting people in. So far, there's about 98 people. Maybe we'll just give another minute or so, and we hopefully can start around at sharp 3 o'clock.
Hi, Dr. Salmah.
Hi, Helena. Long time no see.
Yeah, long time no see. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, after the publication, I think we just go out.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Hello, everybody who just attended. Just give another minute or so. People are still attending. Good news is we are above 100 people right now. Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everybody on behalf of People for Peat. Welcome to the first Regional Peat Symposium. We have like over 100 people, but I'm sure more will be attending. In the interest of time, we'll get it started. My name is Reuben. It's an honor to represent People for Peat, the coalition consisting of WRI Indonesia, IDH, and TRCRC. I am truly excited and humbled to be joined by our distinguished panelists as well as the various participants. I understand there are participants not only from ASEAN region, but all throughout the world. Just to get it started, to have an understanding about where people are coming from, I've just launched a poll. Perhaps you can fill it up while that is going on. I think we can go to the next page while we do a bit of housekeeping. So hopefully people can rename themselves in the Zoom. Just go to your name, click on it, and under that there's option to rename. Please rename to your name and organization so that's easier to communicate. And secondly, please mute all audio to prevent any interruption of the presentation. And lastly, we will be having a Q&A and panel discussion towards the end. Participants are encouraged to use the chat box to ask the questions, and we'll try to address as many of the questions as possible at the end. Of course, the presenters are also welcome to engage during the chat box, but at the same time, the moderator will be expressing, will be requesting the presenters to present, to answer. Next. Next. Yep. So this is the agenda. I'll be doing a quick introduction for the People for Peat. Unfortunately, our funder from EU delegation could not attend. So we will be going straight into the symposium, to the meat of the presentation. I'm sure everybody is eager to hear from our four speakers. At the end of it will be the panel discussion and Q&A. So without further ado, I think we can go ahead with the start of the presentation. Again, a reminder to please mute all audio. Thank you. All right. In relation to the topic for today about why Peatland is important, and in line with what we are interested in, I'm going to play a quick video as a primer. Okay, together we can make a difference. I think that is the intention we approach it in terms of peatland. We are part of EU initiative called SUPA, Sustainable Use of Peatland and Haze Mitigation Program. There is two components in it. One is initiated by or implemented by GIZ, where they work with state actors in terms of regional cooperation, implementation support, and pilot projects in Malaysia, Indonesia. While we, from People for Peat, which again consists of WRI, IDH, and TRCRC, we are mainly working with non-state actors. When we say non-state actors, it is smallholders, private sectors, NGO, CSOs, researchers, and so on. But at the same time, because of the various issues and complexities, peatlands, we definitely need like full cooperation and as well as cooperation with state actors. And that is why we also work with our different ASEAN peatland partners, including Component 1, but also MASA and other programs that are working on peatland with the ultimate aim to reduce fire and haze in the ASEAN region. So yeah, based on the participation today, they're mostly coming from Asia Pacific, but I understand there are also people from the different regions. So yeah, that is aligned with our initiative to be as cooperative as possible. Next. So as we'll hear, not only in this symposium, but the following, there are multiple challenges, and I'm sure the presenters will elaborate on it. Challenges when it comes to managing peatland. We look at it from three main issues about lack of reliable, firstly, lack of reliable data information, secondly, limited options for sustainable business and access to funding, and third is lack of awareness and capacity. So with that in mind, we have our three pillars where we look at it next, where we look at it from how to address these issues. Firstly, in how to increase the data information, where we've engaged multiple focus group discussion and conferences to identify some of the gaps in data information. At the same time, we're having a launch for research proposal, and we'll be compiling and collecting a lot of info into a Peatland Outlook document to be shared with everyone. Within Pillar 2 of business investment, we have our PFP Business Hub, which is just launched with the intention to provide technical assistance to different sustainable land use mechanism and economic activities on peatlands to ensure balance between protection, economic values, as well as social inclusion. And lastly, Pillar 3 is as this program is looking at outreach and advocacy and how to have like more locally driven narratives and engagement events to increase capacity. Next. So this program has been is going for 3 years, implementing period from until 2022. To date, we have done multiple activities. Some of you all are aware within the 3 pillars. Within Pillar 1, we've organized multiple conferences and webinars to, like I mentioned, gather data information. And currently, there's a call for research proposal that is ongoing. So if there's any researchers within the audience who are interested, please do submit it. We'll be sending the link later in the chat box as well. And as mentioned previously, we are also compiling a lot of the data information into a document. Within Pillar 2 as well, we just launched the call for project proposals within the PFP Business Hub as of last week. Again, we welcome if there's any projects involved on peatland. And we have engaged with different panel, a panel of experts with expertise in different areas of peatland management, agriculture, and economic activities in peatlands, as well as business and finance to support in this business hub and provide technical assistance. And like mentioned, for Pillar 3, we are engaging through different media, not social media websites, as well as unfortunately with its current state, there's not much face-to-face engagement, but at the same time that has enabled us to increase the reach. And of course, we have been supporting through like capacity building and workshop type of activities. And example of this is within the symposium. All right, I think that is the brief introduction on the PFP. Now we'll go to the main meat of this event. With that, I will also like to invite the facilitator for this evening's events, Dr. Satrio Adi Wicaksono. Satrio Adi Wicaksono is a forest and land use governance expert at the European Forest Institute's EU RED facility. He received a BA from Wesleyan University, where he double majored in geology and environmental studies and obtained a certificate in international relations. Afterward, he received a PhD in tropical climatology from Brown University, USA. Originally from Jakarta and is currently based in KL, Kuala Lumpur, Satrio has been working at the intersection of actionable environmental research and policy processes in Southeast Asia. He has conducted research and managed projects in the areas of forest and landscape restoration, community-based forest management, forest conservation legality, sustainable commodity production, sustainable ocean management in the past 5 years. And prior to his current position, he developed and managed World Resource Institute Sustainable Ocean and Forest and Landscape Restoration portfolios in Indonesia. So yeah, that is quite a bit of background on him. Looking forward to him facilitating the event. While I welcome Dr. Satrio to take the floor, I will also attend, I will share another poll so that the moderator and speakers have a flavor of the background of different participants involved. Over to you, Dr. Satrio.
All right. Thank you, Reuben, for a very nice, generous introduction. I am honored and very grateful to People for Peat for giving me the opportunity to moderate our symposium today with the theme, Peatlands, Why Are They Important? So good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and please answer the poll question so that we know which working sector you are from. So as Reuben mentioned, I'm from the European Forest Institute, and as a moderator, I would also like to thank you all for joining the symposium, which is the first of a series of 5 symposia on regional peat organized by People for Peat Coalition and funded by the European Union. So now I'm trying to see the results of the survey. What I can see here is that we have people from university or research institutes, about 40-something%, and then about 20% of you are from NGOs or representatives of the community. Some of you are from the private sector, and also we have people from the government. So that's very interesting. That shows that we have people from varied backgrounds joining the symposium today. So my guess would be that each and every one of us here joining the symposium has different experience with peatlands. Perhaps some of you grew up near tropical peat swamps and are familiar with the blackish or brown rusty color of peaty water. Some of us, like myself, perhaps visited peatland area for the first time during our vacation trips or work trips. I remember going to Tanjung Puting National Park in central Kalimantan to see orangutan in a rehabilitation center within the park. And it turns out that to get to the center, I had to take the boat on a river that borders beautiful peat swamp forest. So it was one of my first encounters with peatland. Some of you might have not been to peatland areas, but have been impacted by peatland fires, for example. I now live in Kuala Lumpur, and as other residents of Kuala Lumpur can attest, there were certain years during which air quality and visibility got really bad because of the transboundary haze due primarily to forest and peatland fires in Sumatra, Indonesia. Some of us might also encounter a deeper connection with peatlands by reading news about climate change or through our studies and our works. And perhaps all of us here have heard about the importance of peatlands in storing carbon and therefore playing an important role in climate change mitigation. And then maybe that's why many of you are here, but perhaps many of us have not heard about the important role of tropical peatlands in the water cycle locally and regionally. So when I was working at WRI Indonesia, I had the opportunity to provide technical support to the newly established peatland restoration agency back then in planning restoration of degraded peatlands in certain province in Indonesia. And I learned then that peatland hydrology plays a critical role in peatland functioning and carbon cycling. And we should not forget also that peatlands can be found in different parts of the globe. In fact, some of you joining the symposium today come from Europe, and peat deposits, often named fens or mires, can be found also in Northern Europe, Russia, and Northern America, for example. So some of our panelists who grew up in those regions of the world will be able to tell us more about their experience with temperate peatlands. And I think all of us here can agree that the first step to tackling issues surrounding peatland in Southeast Asia is, of course, to familiarize ourselves with peatlands. So this afternoon, we are fortunate to hear from 4 distinguished scholars who will talk about different aspects of peatlands. 2 are from Malaysia, 1 from Germany, and another 1 from the UK. So they will have the important job of explaining to our benefits why peatlands are important. So we will first hear from Dr. Helena Varkkey from University of Malaya, who will be explaining about the transboundary haze issue and its connection to peatland in depth. So as we know, transboundary haze is a recurring problem and we've seen progress, but the issue still stays there. So that's at the crux of her talk. And after that, we will hear from Dr. Salmah Zakaria from ASM, or Academy of Sciences Malaysia, who will discuss peatland hydrology. Why is peat water management important? What are the challenges and opportunities associated with peat water management? So we'll hear the answers to those questions from Dr. Salmah. And then we will hear from Professor Hans Joosten from University of Greifswald in Germany. He will share some insights from the management of temperate peatlands and discuss if there are lessons learned and best practices that could be useful for the management of tropical peatlands in our region and vice versa. And lastly, we will hear from Professor Susan Page, or Sue Page, as we often call her, to deliver a talk on the various types of ecosystem services that tropical peatlands provide. So each panelist will have about 15 minutes to deliver the talk. And I would remind the speaker as the 15-minute mark is getting close. And before each talk, I will read a short biography of the panelists. So I would like to remind the participants again that please do mute yourself. And there is the chat box where you can type your question and hopefully we can address those questions during the Q&A session. So without further ado, let us welcome our first panelist, Dr. Helena Varkkey, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of International and Strategic Studies, University of Malaya. Her research focuses on the governance of transboundary haze pollution and the political economy of palm oil in Southeast Asia. So she is working to understand how economic development can be reconciled with environmental sustainability in Southeast Asia. Her monograph on the haze problem in Southeast Asia, Palm Oil and Patronage, was published in 2016. So over to you, Dr. Helena.
Thank you, Dr. Satrio, for that introduction. I would like to ask the assistance of the organizers to present. Yeah, okay, now I see it. My apologies to everyone. I am not able to put my video on because of some Zoom issues. So yeah, my apologies for that. So yeah, let's get right to it. So I've been talking, or rather I've been researching and thinking about the haze problem for a very long time. My professional career as an academic, basically all of it has been to do with haze. And interestingly, peat came a bit later in the equation. It actually came in while I was doing my PhD, and that process, starting out from someone who never knew about peat, basically, I never knew what was so interesting about peat. As I began my PhD talking to a lot of people and interviewing people, I began to slowly realize how important peat is in this whole equation. So this is also a very much a learning process for me. And yeah, so I'm very invested in peat right now after many years, and this is something that is very important to me. So I'm very happy that People for Peat has invited me. Thank you so much to speak to you all about the connection between peat and haze, basically. Next, please. So those of you who are from the region would probably be very familiar with this, but those of you who have not, let me just give you a quick background information about haze. So in terms of history, it has historically been recorded as a regional problem since 1983. So you can imagine how many decades we have been facing this problem, and it can affect up to 8, some people say 10 ASEAN states. It means the whole of ASEAN in some way or another is affected by haze on an almost annual basis. So the last one that we had was 2019, if you guys will remember. It causes serious socio-economic and environmental problems in all the areas that it hits. There has been research showing that the death toll, the additional deaths caused by haze during 2015 haze, which was quite a bad episode, could be anywhere between 40,000 to 100,000 additional deaths. So which means that people should not have died, but they did because of the haze. And that's a lot in the whole region, yeah? And other things like lost man hours, tourism will drop during this time, additional firefighting costs, additional health costs, additional medicines that people have to buy, the cost of masks, all this is very burdensome for society. And it has even has effects on our crops and our trees because of the reduced sunlight that comes through. And on very bad occasions, we will have emergencies where the schools will close. We have movement restrictions. And schools close so that the parents will also have to stay home, and hopefully they also don't go out, so it lessens their exposure. Of course, we in Malaysia, we complain about the haze, but we always must remember that the haze is always the very worst near the root, which is basically in these areas in Indonesia which are burning. So you can get air pollution index of up to about 2,000 in the areas really close to the fires in Indonesia. In comparison, for Malaysia, it was about 200 plus during the previous bad haze season. So you can understand the difference of magnitude. And in terms of economy, you can see it's about 2% was calculated for Indonesia in 2015. So that's a serious amount of effect there. Can we go next, please? So what is the link between peat fires and haze? There are various types of forest fires out there, and various types of these fires tend to burn during the dry season. However, peat fires are the one that produce the special kind of smoke that can travel across the borders. And this is what we usually refer to as haze. So even though peat fires may not be the majority type of fire in the region, but its link to haze, most of the haze is caused by peat fires. So what we see is usually from the peatlands. I hope that I can do justice to explaining the science of it, but I think most of my the other speakers that will come after this will do a better job. I've actually learned a lot of the science of haze from their writings as well. I'm not a physical scientist, but I look more into the political science of it, but I will just try anyway, and please, I stand corrected. So basically, as I understand, natural fires in pristine peatlands, like our moderator said, is usually waterlogged. So natural fires are quite rare. However, when peatlands are disturbed, when they are drained for agriculture or for other reasons, they dry out very quickly, and then they are very fire prone. So being fire prone is one thing, but what actually causes the fires? Peat fires can occur either accidentally because of dry conditions, or intentionally as a cheap and easy way to clear land for agriculture. And peatlands, they are very special because they are basically made out of carbon, and this is why fires spread very quickly in the ground, actually making them very hard to put out. So I think we can, so fire accelerates carbon release in peatlands as well. And at one time, this was so bad that Indonesia had actually became one of the top 3 emitters in the world due to peat fires. Now they are no longer, which is good. Next, please. So what are the drivers of land use change on peat? Usually peat, if they are left untouched, is pretty safe. You won't have fires. We do have some small-scale agriculture on peat, but I think not so much, because it's quite hard to manage the wet peatlands for small-scale agriculture if it involves draining. Paludiculture and all, yes, but not so much on the real agriculture, on the crop kind of agricultures. So usually the larger peat-based fires are usually associated with commercial agribusiness activity, either palm oil and pulpwood. And actually, if you look at the sort of charts, the worst fires and haze in Southeast Asia can be linked quite directly to the palm oil boom. And this was the time where a lot of land was being opened up for palm oil, not only in peatlands, but other types of lands as well. Peatlands are generally unsuitable for agriculture. As you can imagine, a flooded land would be generally unsuitable for agriculture. But because of the high demand for land for different types of agribusiness, there was interest in peatlands. And there are a few benefits of planting on peat, fortunately or not. So some types of plants can grow well on peatlands. So for example, palm oil, they can sustain the sort of waterlogged conditions that is required on peatlands, and like acacia also can grow quite well on peatlands as well. The timber that grows on peatlands is good startup capital, so that's very appealing for companies. And usually you don't find many villagers or natives staying on peatlands, because they will stay probably at the borders, but not on the peatland itself, because it's too wet. So they don't have to worry about customary rights and all this kind of stuff, and paying off the native populations or bad publicity. Because of this, even though preparation of peatlands, which involves digging ditches and draining, can be expensive, the returns are high, and that's why there's a high interest in peatlands for agriculture. Next, please. So, but actually by right, peatlands are quite well protected, especially in Indonesia. We have various laws in Indonesia. They have various laws in Indonesia that in various ways kind of limits the use of peat for agriculture. So I've given you some examples here. There are many more, and there are many more recent ones as well. One of the more significant ones that I can mention here is that there's currently a peat moratorium on issuing new licenses to use land designated as primary forest and peat forests since 2011, and was made permanent in 2019. So technically in Indonesia, peatlands are quite well protected under the law. But next, please. But unfortunately, of course, the law is one thing, but the implementation is another. Can we have the next slide? Yeah, so through my research, I realized that it's a very important thing that actually dictates how well these laws are carried out is the existence of patron-client relationships, which I call patronage. And the situation there being that all these companies that are on peatlands are usually those who are very well connected. And even though legally they are not supposed to have these peatlands accessible, but because of their connections, because of, they don't have to do EIAs and this kind of stuff, somehow or other they are able to get access to peatlands. And this also means that there's a lack of enforcement of fire laws as well. So back in the day, before there was more publicity about Haze, I believe a lot of these companies actually did use fire by themselves. I think now, because of all of the publicity about it, companies are more careful now. But as I remember, Dr. Salmah explained to me before, the fact that they are on peatlands, it already makes it very dangerous and fire prone, because peatlands are, of course, basins. And if you drain one area, the whole area gets dried out anyway. So you will have fires on the borders, just outside plantations, you know. So just the very fact that they are there is worrisome already. And so this actually supports a culture of impunity, where these companies are not really afraid and they can do what they want. And this is sort of maintaining the situation where peatlands catch fire, and then once they have burnt, they very easily catch fire again in the next year. And then we have this almost yearly situation of haze. Next, please.
And you have about 5 minutes left.
Great, that's all I need. So this has ended up in a situation where, even though peatlands are technically well protected in law, but we can see that about a quarter of peatlands in Malaysia and Indonesia combined are actually used for industrial plantations. And out of this, about 20% of the 27% is palm oil, and the rest of the 7% is pulp and paper. So we can see that this is the loophole there that is happening. So next, please. So ASEAN as a region has been looking into this problem for quite some time. ASEAN has considered haze a regional problem since 1985, and there's been various things that they have done to try and address this directly through regional governance. We have an ASEAN peatland management strategy, and this, and I believe SUPA is also under this. We also have the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, which is one among the many agreements that has been put into place. But the ASEAN Agreement is very special because it's one of the only legally binding documents in ASEAN, which of course ASEAN does not really like legally binding things. So that was a beacon of hope for ASEAN. However, due to various limitations, like I've listed down here, and also due to the fact that, you know, there is this also strong sort of patronage kind of thing that trickles upwards as well, where countries would like to also protect their own interests. Palm oil is a very important sector for both countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, and also to a certain extent to Singapore as well. This has caused all kinds of limitations to the effectiveness of regionalism. Next, please. So, in short, haze is a very complex and multi-directional issue. Malaysia and Singapore is the worst affected outside of Indonesia. However, a lot of the agricultural land in Indonesia is linked to Malaysian and also some Singaporean interests as well. So all of this is tied up in this really real complex web of patronage. And there's also regional patronage webs that we have to be concerned about, where Malaysian and Singaporean companies are also protected by their clients back home as well. So it's a whole regional thing going on. And again, bounded by, you know, ASEAN way kind of culture, Malaysia and Singapore cannot really force Indonesia to do anything. You know, if they say anything, Indonesia will point fingers at them. And it's just going to be coming into a blame game that usually every year that's what happens at the end of the day. So it's very hard to productively have a regional cooperation on haze at the ASEAN level. Next, please. So now I'm going to my last few slides. So this is some of the things that Indonesia has been doing recently. So Jokowi came into power just on the brink of a haze season. So haze has become a very big issue for him. However, Jokowi has not been really very forthcoming with ASEAN because Jokowi is more of a globalist rather than an ASEANist. And also we all know about the Omnibus Law, which kind of loosens up a lot of forest policies, which will actually, people are worrying that it will actually roll back a lot of peatland protection laws as well. So this is a threat. Next, please. Malaysia, still undecided if it wants to take a hard or a soft stance on haze. Usually it's very much in line with Indonesia's stance with non-interference. But Malaysia has been kind of flip-flopping over whether it wants to go in a more legal angle, similar to what Singapore has done in the past. At the moment, the government has shelved the law again. And locally as well, Malaysia has its own fire problems on peat. So it's a bit difficult for them to engage when they have their own problems as well. Yeah, and also we have still continued to identify palm oil as one of our key programs, and we are still looking into expanding into peat. Next, please. So recent developments is that consumer pushback and the exposure about this has led to quite a lot of practices on the ground becoming better. Like I said, now there's not really much intentional fires anymore. But some of these companies have been found to be flouting these regulations. Medium-sized companies, which are not so famous, they're not so consumer fronting, they are in the gray area. And a lot of these mechanisms are only now involving smallholders. So smallholders also may have palm oil plantations, for example, on these areas. And related political tensions like the EU biofuel issue is making palm oil even more political. So there's a lot of defensiveness going on. Next, please. And finally, what can we do? One of the issues with haze is that it is seasonal. It comes and goes. So this is not good for public voice because we only care about it when it's there. So we have to have a sustained public voice in expressing our dissatisfaction over the haze. We should always check for sustainability labels, report open burning in your area. Even small fires can become bigger. Support alternate livelihoods on peatlands that do not involve draining. Support initiatives like PFP, and of course also spread the word about the importance of peatlands, because like I said myself, I also did not know of how important peatlands is back in the day. So that's all for me. My last slide is just some contact information. I will be happy to continue any of these points in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Varkkey. Thank you for very nicely outlining the challenges with peatland governance at the national and regional level, and for setting the context geopolitically. So next we will have our second speaker, Dr. Salmah Zakaria. So I'll read her biography briefly. So she's a fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia. As an ASM fellow, she chaired the ASM Task Force on Climate Change Adaptation. Dr. Salmah was previously with UNESCAP, which is the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, as a senior water specialist. Her work at ESCAP includes research on integrated water resources management, water and green growth, water food energy nexus, and so on. Dr. Salmah has a doctorate in water management in deep peat soils and a master's in land and water management from Cranfield Institute of Technology in the UK. She was also a co-chair of the Asia Pacific Water Forum Steering Group on Water and Climate Change Adaptation, and a former steering committee member of Global Water Partnership Organization. Dr. Salmah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Forgot to unmute it. I'd like to share. Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. And I would also like to thank the organizer for inviting me. It's a long time since I talk about peat. These days, I normally talk about water resources management and integrated water resources management. Then we'll be looking at the importance, challenges, and opportunities, beginning with introduction and then ending up with moving forward. Yeah. In the introduction, I'll be looking at the soil distribution, the physical and chemical properties. There is an estimated, as I said, I have moved on from peat, although peat has always been something that interests me. This 2.4 million hectares is for Malaysia in 1985 figures. And if we look at the definition of peat soil, which is more than 5 meters deep, many of the areas would have already been reduced in terms of depth. But if you look at this particular site, we will find in Peninsular Malaysia, most of the peat along the coast, the green one is the peat deposit. and generally in isolated independent peat basins, and most have been reclaimed for agriculture. I think almost all the areas, even the one in Tanjung Karang, around it, people are working into the deposit. And when we look at Sarawak, for example, the peat soil are also found on the coastal areas, seemingly closer as compared to the peat soil in Peninsula, probably due to the development of back swamps behind alluvial deposits in the coastal periphery. But as you go closer, you can independent isolated peat basins can be discerned within the designated peat areas. And to me, this indicate the possibility of ensuring integrated water management within each independent peat basin. So what are peat? It's simply just rotted leaves, twigs, trunks. The color can just move from darkish red to brown, the one that I'm working with. And originally the high water water table is very high and it is very acidic. This is the environment that I was working in. You see the first on the first side is how it looks like before we reclaim it, and you can see on the other the right side, secondary forest, the one that I constructed drains for my doctoral study, and you can see some of the timbers still very well preserved. And this is a schematic diagrams. In the real peat soil, you don't see this like this. I was looking at how I want to show how much water there is in the peat soil by clumping all those soils, clay, all these organic soil together. So you can see that it is almost like floating peat soil within a water ecosystem. And if you drain it, the top part will be more, what do you call that, denser. And if I look at the results that I get from my studies in 1992, you can see that the earliest drain peat in Parit Sikong, which is about 1970, that's when the Johor Barat was opened up. Before we have the Haze, we opened up the peat soil in Johor Barat for the smallholders. We can see that the dry bulk density is about 0.2 gram per cc. But when you go down to the undrained, it's not even reaching 0.08 gram per cc. And when you look at the hydraulic conductivity values is very important because that's how you design your water management system. And it is very high in peat soil. The higher it is, the faster the water drains out. And it has a very high holding capacity as compared to non-peat soil. And that's also the reason why it has very high K values. Therefore, it is important to keep the water table high to stop it from drying. When you look at the bearing capacity, it's almost none in a natural peat soil at the beginning before it's draining. What you are stepping on is what do you call that? All the mesh of woods and twigs. But if you are a heavy person, even for me, I would just, my feet would just sink into the soil. And the porosity, of course, is very high, indicating a substantial storage capacity, which is therefore quite suitable for the peat soil to be a water resources retention area for the Tanjung Karang. And this is also quite important, the capillarity. Effectively, you don't have to go to 15 bar because the graph from 5 to 15 bar is almost straight. And the capillary fringe is very short, so to say, and substantially lower as compared to clay. In clay, because the porosity is very small, it can the water can rise very high. And the importance again of why when we design a drainage system, the water table needs to be nearer the root system, especially the fibrous root system like oil palm, pineapple, because they cannot access water deeper like the one with the taproot system. Now when you look at subsidence rate, this one is the one that I have is from Andresi, is in the FAO Bulletins 1988. Subsidence is influenced by local temperature and drain depth, and is attributed to dewatering drainage because of the soil settlement and the shrinkage. The moment you drain out the water, it will settle down, and then it will compact even by itself without any what do you call that, any because the soil itself, once it is above the water table, is an overburden pressure. Then there is the oxidation and mineralization. The moment the oxygen goes into the voids, it will just mineralize. And of course, once it's dry, it is just good fodder for peat. And if you look at this, I will revisit this subsidence rate again later, but this is something that we have to be aware of, why we have to keep the water table high. The chemical properties is not something that I will go into because it's not my area, but here are some for references. And the importance, essentially the peatland is part of the natural landscape. It has immense biodiversity and it has impact on mitigation and adaptation. Now, if you look at this soil map, you will see that the peat is all on the coastal side, and the basin, the dark green, is somehow quite independent in peninsula. And I would also like to say that this peat deposit acts as a natural detention areas during wet seasons, and that's very important to us in the tropical areas, both Indonesia and Malaysia. We have such very heavy rain. And I like
you
to...
have about 5 minutes left, Doctor.
Oh my God, because I'm going quite this one. Okay, these are the river basins that I feel you all have to be aware that every single inch is a river basin, and at the downstream of the river basin, you will find the peat soil, and you can see why it is more than the tiny river basins along the coast. And for the Langat River, you will see the peat soil at the downstream there. And this is again the peat soil deposit, how it's formed. You can look at it. And the biodiversity, you can now understand why people do not go into reclaiming the land, because it's has very low bearing capacity and the water table is high, but it is very rich in flora and fauna. And in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation, it is a natural retention area for flood waters, and the substrate is good for carbon sequestration. And if you drain the peat, you lost these two functions. The challenges, impact of peat reclamation. The other one is peat fire. And I like to say that when you drain the soil, you are actually reclaiming the soil, and therefore you have to look into the whole gamut of what is needed in terms of reclamation. The impact of peat reclamation, I think, is coming from will result in subsidence fires, and because each of the peat what you call that independent deposit are contiguous, you will have the drying and subsidence of non-targeted area, and the peat fire spreading to non-targeted area, and of course the smog and flooding and the loss of the peat mass. Again, as I said just now, peat basins are contiguous, and this is the subsidence. And I would like you all to look at the temperature in our countries, 30 degrees, and if you are draining at 120 centimeter, you are looking at losing the peat at about 10 centimeter per annum. And these are some pictures. This one, the one that you see clay, that was 1 meter of peat soil before we drain it. And the hands between the one who's wearing white, that's where it was. And you can see the structures all subsiding. Here is another peat in subtropical Florida, and you can see that it has subsided from 1912, and now it is below the surrounding land. Managing peat fires, you've got to look at whether it's a virgin peat, a drained peat, or and how to manage the peat in an integrated manner. We look at this. As I said, if it's untouched, stop the fire from being triggered. And there are the things here that you can look. Just stop it if you want to go with, if you want to avoid the fire. If you're looking at drain, reclaim peat areas, you have to look at what are the various economic activities and identify the perimeter, the boundary of the pit soil, and what are the various field water requirement. And then as far as possible, just plug all the outlet and design the required drainage management system to ensure the water level does not fall below the required water levels. Again, this is the Langat pit swarm, and I just wanted to show those of you who are familiar with Langat, then you will know that we have one on one side, Paya Indah, and the other side is Cyberjaya. Look at the diagram number 1. When we started the whole thing, it's probably about the same level. Then maybe Cyberjaya was drained because you need a higher bearing capacity, but soon the Langat will just drain out too. So we need to look at how do we manage it. The first thing is we need to understand the peat genesis, that it is organic, it is going to mineralize, and the fact that you just have to drain it to use it unless you want to retain it for a total peat forest, and then you need to deliberate all the technical things that I have listed here. What is needed if you want to go into reclamation of peat swarm for whatever activities you're looking at, and you need to come up with policies which, if agreed, should be adhered to. The opportunities, of course, determines the water table drawdown. If it's national park and forestry, you can keep the water table high. But if you're talking water supply, also you need to keep the water table high. But you have to be aware of the fact that the pollution to the water supply, if it's for water supply for domestic and industrial, it will be coming also from the adjacent areas. Now, the choice of economic activities, if it's aquaculture, it's depending on the fish pond design. If it's agriculture, it's depending on the root system, which can be anywhere from 40 centimeter for oil palm, or others for taproot, it can go to as deep as 90 centimeter.
Your time is actually up, so if you can wrap up, that would be great, Doctor.
Can I just, I think I need a bit, because I think it's quite important to know that in terms of industry and housing, you really need to draw it down, because otherwise you won't get the bearing capacity and you will have all those subsidies. Moving forward, so the management of peat drainage should not be on a piecemeal basis. So if you have a peat, an independent peat basin like here in Simanggang, what you need to do is to come up with a typical laid out modern polder for that particular independent peat swarm. If this is where you see in Tanjung Karang, where we preserve the peat swarm to maintain the water table and to supply the water table. Then there is the rest that you can read through. This is something that you may want to follow through yourself, how to develop, how to select a developable independent peat basin. And once you have already make that choice, and how to go to what kind of activities, economic activities you'd like to have. So in conclusion, any economic development in peat soil other than its natural function requires it to be preceded by net drainage, and you will therefore drain it and dry it, and that is going to be very good for fodder for fire. And the determination of the final peat depth should be estimated and incorporated into the project economic viability at 30 years, 25 years, because if you remember, I showed that it can be as high as 10 centimeter per annum. I think with that, I'd like to say thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salmah, for comprehensively explaining the biophysical and hydrological characteristics of peatlands and how our understanding of those is very important for managing peatland sustainably. So next, we will have our third speaker, who's Professor Hans Joosten. Professor Joosten is Professor of Peatland Studies and Paleoecology at the University of Greifswald in Germany, and also co-founder of Greifswald Mire Center. Professor Joosten has been the Secretary General of the IMCG, which is the International Mire Conservation Group, the World Organization of Peatland Conservationists, since 2000. So he has been involved intensively in UNFCCC negotiations and IPCC guidance development, especially with respect to emissions from organic soils, and also involved in FAO in advancing climate responsible peatland management. In 2016, he edited the first handbook on paludiculture, or sustainable management of peatlands through wet agriculture. Since 2017, he has also been a member of the steering committee of the UN Global Peatlands Initiative. Professor Joosten, it's over to you now.
Okay, I have been asked to talk about the teachings that temperate peatlands have brought to tropical peatlands. And when I heard this question, let me see whether I can move my thing now. Yes. I struck upon, of course, the difference between teaching and learning. Teaching is the sharing of knowledge, and learning is the acquisition of knowledge. And I ask myself, if we say, yeah, temperate peatlands have to teach the tropical world, I think this is a little bit arrogant, and it reminded me of the white man's burden, where Kipling said that Europe and America have to carry the colored people to the mountain of civilization. I don't think that it is working this way. That's why I have changed the title a little bit. What can we together learn from temperate and tropical peatland management? And I have formulated 10 lessons that come from this experience. First, it is good to be aware that Europe has a very long history of peatland use and peatland study. The first scientific book solely devoted to peatlands is from 1658. And interestingly, this book already has a chapter on peatland restoration. From the beginning of peatland use and study, people have been worried whether the degradation of peatlands could be turned back. A second very important and old lesson is that drained peatlands burn. They burn deep, they burn long, and they burn frequently. Important is that most of the principles of peatland functioning were known before the discovery of tropical peatlands. A book like of Dow from 1823 contains very important insights about the functioning of umbrotrophic peatlands. The book of Weber actually formulates all the important concepts that we need for peatland ecology. Already Aristotle, the Greek, 400 years before Christian era, reported on peat fires in Italy, where the water is warm and the smell is deep and heavy, and no bird flies over them because it could fall down and die. Interestingly, this same peatland still burns regularly nowadays. Here, a picture of this peatland burning in 2006. The Roman author Tacitus, in the 1st, 2nd century of Christian era, reported on peat fires in Germany. Fires suddenly bursting from the earth, seized everywhere on country houses, crops, and villages, and were rushing onto the very walls of the newly found colony. Nor could they be extinguished by the fall of rain, or by river water, or by any other moisture. And that reminds, of course, of the news of the large Meppen peat fire in Germany in the summer of 2015, or about the huge fire in my own peatland at home in the Netherlands in 2020, where many houses and people had to be evacuated. We have medieval testimonies of peat fires in Russia in 1092, 1223, 1430. And nowadays still peat burns, drained peatlands burn in Russia, even in winter below the snow, where you see here the smoke coming from under the snow. An important lesson is also, and an old lesson, that haze burdens far beyond the peatland itself. Here a picture of Borneo with the plumes of many peatland fires. But we had peat fires as a management technique in 19th century Germany. It was the very large-scale buckwheat fire culture where peatlands were burned to open them up for the cultivation of this crop. The smoke was so intense that the haze from this peatland burning in Germany spread over Europe, and there is a map how far the smoke, the haze have spread in 1848, 1857, and 1863. It moved more than 1,000 kilometers. And this was actually in 1863 fires, where also the reason that the first environmental NGO was founded in Europe, the Society Against Peatland Burning. This reminds us, of course, of the enormous expansion of haze over Equatorial Asia in 1997 and in follow-up years. An important lesson and an old lesson is also that drained peatlands subside. You start with a wet peatland, and to use it, you're going to drainage. And as a result, the peatland subsides and the relative water table rises again, and it becomes again a wet peatland that you have to drain to continue the same usage. And in this way, you bog yourself down. That is what is called in Europe the vicious circle of peatland utilization. You bog yourself down. This has been measured already for a long time in Europe. There are polls in, let me see, I do not see what I'm writing myself anymore here. There are polls in Bavaria that show that 3 meters of height has been lost since 1836. In the UK, a poll, 4 meters lost since 1870. And in Germany, already 10,000 of hectares of agricultural peatland has been flooded because they could no longer be economically drained. This is a peatland close to where I live, and on the shield is standing that the road is very bad. The Netherlands, the country where I originally come from, has been draining peatlands for 1,000 years. Subsidence in the Netherlands is only 1 centimeter per year, but 1,000 years of peatland drainage means that you go down 10 meters and that you change a country from above sea level to a country below sea level. And the area between Amsterdam and The Hague and Utrecht has been subsided more than 8 meters. And we should not forget in the tropics, as we have just seen in the presentation, subsidence goes 5 times faster, as you can see here. This long fellow, 2 meters 5 high, this height was consumed by subsidence in a few decades only. There are old descriptions of subsidence from Dutch people working in Indonesia, in Delhi and Sumatra. Like all peat soils, the peat volume decreases very much and the surface thus approaches the drainage level. In general, the land will continuously subside as a result of drainage. And returning to the same land in the next year, one finds the land laying deeper than before. Subsidence is a known process already for a long time, and it has become more acute since climate change is driving the rise of sea level. Because whereas the sea level is rising, we bog the peatlands of the world down. Many tropical peatlands, also in Southeast Asia, are coastal and will with continuous drainage and this enormous amount of rainfall that you have become undrainable. And this drained peatland use will lead to the loss of millions of hectares of productive land. There are many more environmental issues associated with peatland drainage. A lot of them that I will not manage, but they are summarized in this graph. So the most important message of all these environmental catastrophes associated with peatland drainage is keep wet peatlands wet. The natural peatlands, don't drain them because you introduce a lot of trouble. Keep wet peatlands wet applies both to the temperate peatlands and to the tropical peatlands. In the tropical peatlands, probably even more because the degradation is going much faster. The other message that comes from there is, of course, that you have to drain, that you have to make the drained peatlands wet again. You have to stop this drainage, to stop these negative aspects of drained peatlands. And also that applies to temperate peatlands and to tropical peatlands. And the good message is to a large extent, rewetting works. Rewetting works, we have different problems that we have to address, but we have one solution. If we want to fight fire and haze, rewetting is a crucial aspect. If we want to reduce emissions, we have to rewet. The higher, the better. And if you want to stop subsidence and the loss of land, we have to rewet fully.
We have about 5 more minutes, Professor.
Yes. A seventh lesson is that full rewetting and restoration is often difficult, very difficult, and even often impossible. We should not underestimate the problems that we have introduced with peatland degradation. It is not very easy to turn it back. That has technical aspects. We have technical problems that we really do not know how to deal with that. For example, in the Netherlands, we had a huge dam of 4 meters high collapsed after a very big rainfall event, and that almost swapped an entire village away. And as a consequence, enormous, huge new dikes had to be made. So expensive. In this peatland alone of 2,000 hectares, they have spent 150 million euros for building dams to restore. We notice in the tropical areas that the dams that we are building and other projects are building are rapidly collapsing. It is not easy. But the most important issue, I think, is that there are also almost insolvable ecological problems after peatland degradation, both in the temperate zone and in the tropics. And we end up with areas that are too dry for peatlands, and if we re-wet them, they become too wet for the trees that have to establish to restore the peatland and its hydrology. The eighth lesson is that drainage-based livelihoods are unsustainable. In the Netherlands, we have drained peatlands already for a long time, and that has led, like this example from 1463, to enormous floodings that the sea breaks the dikes and causes a lot of death casualties and the loss of land. So the conclusion is, if we need to use them, we have to use them wet. And that is actually what the concept of paludiculture is all about. Paludiculture, both being in development in the temperate zone, but also paludiculture in the tropics with here Purun in Indonesia. This consequence, this conclusion that peatlands have to be kept wet was already drawn by Betju Polak, I think one of the most important researchers of tropical peatlands. She worked over 50 years in peatlands. She described and studied most of the peatlands of Indonesia, made the first map, discovered that they are eutrophic, and at the end of her life, she came to the conclusion that in our time, exploitation and conservation of nature are opposed to each other. Exploitation of the extensive peat forests is difficult and expensive and cannot be very profitable. It should be recommended to leave the regional peat forest in their natural state or use them for timber growing with the application of proper silvicultural techniques. These practices may not involve measures interfering with the natural environment. After she has studied peatlands, after she had tried to improve livelihoods of people living in peatlands in Java, in Rawalabok, she came to the conclusion there is no future, no sustainable future for drainage-based peatlands. The ninth lesson, almost the last one, is that peatlands are both different and similar. You hear often that temperate peatlands are so different from tropical peatlands that you cannot compare them and that you cannot learn from each other. I think this is completely wrong. We have temperate peat swamp forests that look very much like tropical peatland forest, and we have tropical sedge mires that look exactly and function exactly the same as temperate sedge mires. I think that it's important to note that peatlands differ substantially from forests, specifically with their emissions. Forest emissions, wood carbon, is related to land use change, whereas peatland emissions, peat carbon, is related to the resulting land use, and peatland emissions are cumulative. We can see that in this graph. If you decrease the rate of deforestation in a forest, you decrease the annual emissions. But if you decrease the rate of peatland drainage, you still increase the annual greenhouse gas emissions, because the emissions from newly drained peatlands add to those of already drained peatlands. To stop the increase of emissions, we have to stop the drainage, and to stop all emissions, we have to re-wet all peatlands. Important is to be aware that peatlands worldwide share many properties, and therefore we should use the experience from elsewhere. The learning curve has been very fast, especially in Indonesia. Indonesia has drained a lot of peatlands, but it has seen the catastrophes and they have changed their policy. I think that the temperate world can learn nowadays very much from tropical Indonesia. Not that everything that is happening in Indonesia is perfect and good, but they achieve more than Europe is doing until now. We have still not learned enough from each other. And therefore, the last lesson is we have to work and learn together. We have to share and we have to support. And the main ultimate lesson of all is peatlands must be wet for the climate, for the land, for the people forever. We will not achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement without addressing the peatlands. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I just realized that I was muted. So thank you so much, Professor Joosten, for taking us through the 10 important lessons from peatlands in the tropics and the temperate regions. There are important messages and principles that you mentioned there that everyone working on peatland issues need to always keep in mind. And next, we will have our last speaker of the day. But before that, I want to remind the participants, if you have questions, please type that in the chat feature, and then we'll get to the questions later during the Q&A session. So Professor Suzanne Page, or Professor Sue Page, holds a personal chair in the School of Geography, Geology, and Environment at the University of Leicester in the UK. For the last 25 years, her research has focused on peatland ecology and carbon dynamics, including ecosystem service, provision, and restoration. She also investigates opportunities to balance food production, livelihood support, and climate security. She has been a partner in a number of research programs in the UK, Southeast Asia, and more recently, the Congo Basin. Professor Page has had advisory roles to government bodies, private companies, and NGOs. She was also a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and has authored more than 100 journal papers, books, book chapters, and technical reports. She is the recipient of several medals awarded by the Royal Geographical Society, Institute of British Geographers, and the Society for Ecological Restoration. So Professor Sue Page, it's over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you also to the other speakers this morning, because I should be, this afternoon I should say, I shall be picking up on a few of the points that have already been raised. Okay, so the organisers of this symposium asked me to address ecosystem services that are provided by Peatland Landscapes, and whilst I'll have a focus on Southeast Asia, of course, we know from the previous presentation that peatlands are by far not confined to that region. So I'll also be referring to some data on global peatlands. So can we have the first slide, please? So in terms of the ecosystem services that peatlands provide, we can think of these in terms of regulating services, cultural services, supporting services, and provisioning services. And I'm really going to be focusing on the regulating services with a focus on carbon storage and climate regulation, and then move on to think about the provisioning services and how sometimes those two types of services that peatlands provide can be in conflict. Next slide, please. So starting off by thinking about carbon, increasingly we now start to understand what a really important role that peatlands globally play in terms of carbon storage. So if we think about the proportion of carbon that is in global soils, and these are debatable figures because it depends on the depth to which your estimates are based, but in general terms, you can see there from the pie diagram that actually peat soils are making a huge contribution globally to the total stock of carbon that's in our soils. And you can see there that this almost equals, it was approaching the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. It certainly exceeds the amount of carbon that's stored in the total world's vegetation cover, and is far in excess of known oil reserves. And of that total peatland carbon stock, about a sixth of that is located in the tropics. So that's a sizable portion. And of course, we're finding out more about our tropical peatlands all of the time, with the Congo peatland carbon stock still really being investigated. Next slide, please. But peatlands are subject to considerable agents of change, and those have already really been addressed in the previous presentation. So particularly focusing on tropical peatlands, the biggest drivers of change are land use change. Next slide, please. And fire. So we've already seen a powerful presentation by Dr. Varkkey on the impacts that fires have in the Southeast Asian region. Next slide, please. So we know that the carbon stocks in peatlands are not, they're not protected. They're not 100% protected, and therefore we have to think about ways in which we can secure those carbon stocks. And this is even more vital given agreements such as the Paris Agreement to limit the impacts of human land use and other activities on our global climate. And when we think about peatland carbon stocks in terms of the Paris Agreement and the very short time available between now and when we need to meet our net zero emissions commitments, then we realize that the sort of timeframes that we're talking about are really limiting. So Professor Joosten has already referred to the issues that we have with restoring peatlands. Once they're damaged, it's not an easy job to put them back into a condition where they will start to accumulate carbon from the atmosphere. And so we recognize, therefore, that tropical peatlands have a huge store of carbon, but most of that within the timescales that we're talking about of the Paris Agreement are not recoverable on those timescales. They're not recoverable on a 30-year timescale. If we damage those peatlands today, we will not be able to recover those carbon stocks on decadal timescales. It will take centuries, if not millennia. So vulnerable carbon stocks are found in tropical peatlands, they're top of the list there, followed by mangroves, also very relevant to the Southeast Asian region. And then we see our boreal and temperate peatlands. They have a huge carbon stock like our tropical peatlands, but most of that carbon is not at the present time threatened by land use change. Next slide, please. Well, what will happen if we do nothing about our peatlands? What will happen if we do nothing about the drainage of peatlands, about the land use change that's happening on peatlands? Well, our peatlands, as Professor Joosten has indicated, will just continue to be a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we want to do something about climate change, we have to act now, and we have to implement changes rapidly over the next few decades. Next slide, please. But we also know that peatlands are important in terms of the provisioning services that they provide. They support livelihoods, they support agriculture. And so we're now faced with a position where we're trying to balance those really important regulating services with the provisioning services. And of course, we know that for most forms of agriculture on peatland, this involves drainage. And if we drain peatlands, we emit the carbon. So we have a conflict between supporting livelihoods and supporting carbon storage. Next slide, please. And this is particularly critical in Southeast Asia. So if we look at how much the peatlands in Southeast Asia are now under drained land uses, they're about a quarter of the peatlands are under industrial plantations, and another quarter are under smallholder agriculture for a range of different crops. Next slide, please. And the smallholder sector is one that really hasn't received as much intensive study, a lot of information, growing body of information about the impacts of large-scale plantation agriculture on peatlands and peat emissions, but until very recently, the smallholder sector has not really been the focus of most studies. We're changing that, fortunately. We have been lucky to receive funding to work on the smallholder sector. And it is important because this is a sector where there are probably opportunities to manage the land in somewhat different ways that might be able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but also some of the other issues associated with peatland drainage that Dr. Salmah was able to introduce to us. Of course, smallholder farming is also a source of fires in the landscape as well. Next slide, please. So in total, the plantation landscapes, the smallholder areas over the last 25, 30 years have become a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. Over the period 1990 to 2015, they may have been, in total, all of these drained peatlands may have emitted something like 2,500 million tonnes of carbon. And just to give you some idea of how that compares, in England, well, in the UK, let's say, we have a total peat carbon stock that's 5,500 million tonnes. So that puts that emission in some sort of perspective when you compare it with our total UK peat carbon stock. Next slide, please. And as Dr. Salmah indicated, draining peatlands isn't just about greenhouse gas emissions, it's also about subsidence and lowering of the peat surface. And in this respect, the smallholder farmers are actually often at the greatest risk because they usually occupy the land on the shallow peat, at the fringes of the peat domes, where the risk of riverine and coastal flooding is greatest. And we are already seeing that increasing risk of flooding is threatening the livelihoods of some of these farmers. Next slide, please. So the slide that I previously showed also indicated that, of course, we are also concerned about emissions from and management of peatlands in the boreal and the temperate zone. And I want to focus now on temperate peatlands, particularly in the UK. Next slide, please. and just draw some parallels with what we're seeing in peatlands in Southeast Asia. Just as in Southeast Asia, we find that we have high emissions from peatlands that have been drained, particularly those that have been drained for some form of agricultural land use. So in terms of organic peat soils in the UK, the highest emissions come from peatlands which have been drained and converted for cropland or for improved grassland for pasture use. Next slide, please. And just as we see in Southeast Asia, and as Professor Joosten has already introduced, we have a very extensive areas of peat loss. So if we take the peatlands just of eastern England, on that map, the red areas are the remaining peat that is deep, that is more than 40 centimetres deep. All of the orange areas were previously deep peatlands, which have lost their peat, often to depths so that the peat is no longer any more than 40 centimetres deep. All of that area that's coloured in orange is now at or below sea level. So this requires that the land has to receive pump drainage to prevent the rivers flooding into these areas. And just to repeat the picture of the famous Home Post there with one of my PhD students, that you can see is the loss of land surface, decrease in land surface over a period of about 150 years, so about 4 meters, quite an impressive land shrinkage, placing Home Village one of the lowest points on the British landscape, well below sea level. Next slide, please.
And you have about 5 minutes.
Lovely, thank you. But peatlands in the east of England, as in Southeast Asia, support livelihoods, and they also support food security. Next slide, please. So we have a problem. We have to square this circle. How do we balance our regulating services with our provisioning services? Recognizing we need to support livelihoods and economies, but equally understanding that peatland mismanagement, if we want to call it that, is leading to very high greenhouse gas emissions and climate impacts that are shared from the local level to the global level. Next slide, please. So we need to meet the Paris Agreement. If we're going to do that, we need to seek substantial cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, including from our peatlands. And without rehabilitation measures for our peatlands, we are not going to be able to keep global warming below the required 2 degrees centigrade. So we do need to bring our drain peatlands back to or nearer to net greenhouse gas neutrality. Next slide, please. One of the ways in which we might be able to do that is through so-called payments for ecosystem services schemes, which might be funded by, for example, voluntary carbon markets to keep the carbon locked away in the peat. Next slide, please. And various schemes like this have been rolled out in the UK. 4 projects under the Peatland Code have been validated to date. There are others in the pipeline. And here, estimated benefits of restoring peatland include avoided carbon emissions and also biodiversity benefits. So there are vehicles available. Next slide, thank you. And also water companies, for example, in the UK are interested and are investing in peatland restoration because peatland damage and drainage leads to poor water quality in our drinking water reservoirs. Next slide, please. And we're also seeing similar schemes in Indonesia. Perhaps the Ketingin Bentaya project is a good example where peatland protection and restoration is being driven through the sale of carbon credits. I think so payment for ecosystem services could have enormous potential, but we must avoid being biased towards services such as carbon protection that are the easiest to monetize. Next slide, please. And of course, one of the biggest challenges is delivering incentives and techniques to improve ecosystem service delivery for agricultural peatlands. And that's an issue whether we're in the UK or we're in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. And there are a whole range of constraints. One of the ways in which you could try to do this is to raise the water level in these landscapes. but there are a whole range of constraints associated with that we have to work through with the land managers. Next slide, please. But as Professor Joosten has introduced, there are possibilities maybe linked to high water table crop production. That again, it has various constraints associated with it. And I fear there is a danger of raising expectations in what can be realistically achieved in peopled landscapes such as those in the east of England or in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, there are opportunities, there are a potential to balance the regulation and provisioning services. And here in a paper that was published last week, we talk about opportunities for raising peatland water tables at the same time as trying to maintain business as usual land uses. It's extending the agricultural lifetimes of these crops, of these land uses, while at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. If we do nothing, then we have the business as usual scenario on the left. If we do something, then we have opportunities to reduce the huge emissions that come from our peatlands, and not only to restore them in terms of their role as a carbon sink, but also to restore their other ecosystem services as well in relation to biodiversity, for example. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we have intact peatlands that provide important ecosystem services, but we know that we lose many of those regulating services once those peatlands have been converted to agriculture. Degraded peatlands pose a high risk, certainly a high climate risk, and therefore ultimately high cost to society. The challenge that we're trying to work through in our research is how we balance climate and livelihood security. Last slide, please. So we have to look at opportunities. We need to certainly conserve our intact or semi-intact systems. We need to restore, where appropriate, our damaged peatland ecosystems. And where peatlands are supporting livelihoods and food security, we have to come up with smart ways that we can manage these landscapes to maintain some level of production whilst greatly reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sue Page, and congratulations on the paper that was just published last week. Thank you for clearly explaining the various services that peatlands provide. So as you clearly explained, as carbon storage, and also the various provisioning services for humans and the trade-offs that come with the utilization of those services. And I'm glad you also brought the topic of smallholders there. So now we are entering the next part of the symposium, which is the Q&A session. So if I may ask Dr. Salmah to also turn on your camera. I know Dr. Varkkey, you have a problem with your camera. I mean, that's fine, but we already have here several questions from the participants. And the participants, if you have questions, please type those questions on the chat feature. Meanwhile, I'll start asking some of you the questions that have been given to us. So maybe the first question, I would like to start with Dr. Varkkey. So this is a question from Joosten from People for Peat. This is a bit of a localized question, but I thought we can start with that. So Joe said that the Malaysian Environment and Water Minister recently scrapped a proposed Transboundary Haze Act that would provide the Malaysian government instruments to pursue legal action against Malaysian companies causing haze in other ASEAN nations, claiming that direct negotiations with ASEAN countries will be more effective. Can you share with us your thoughts on this development?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jokian. Yeah, so this one is what I mentioned just now about Malaysia kind of flip-flopping between actually wanting to take a harder or more legal stance or otherwise. So this bill actually goes back, or this act goes back to the time where Singapore had their similar act. I think Malaysia's decision to first of all sort of be a bit quiet on this was in response to how Indonesia reacted to Singapore when Singapore announced the act. And the reason for Indonesia's reaction was very much due to the fact that Singapore's law had the ability, technically had the ability to bring to court even Indonesians or anyone for that matter, whoever caused haze in Singapore would be liable under this law. And of course, this caused some discomfort in Indonesia and a lot of backlash. And this was why Malaysia kind of softened down on the act. However, when we had a change of government and we had a new government and a new ministry for MESTEC, which was focused on climate change specifically, the act was revived, but with a difference. So the understanding was that the reason why it was not very well received was because of this worry about diplomatic concerns where Indonesia might get angry at us. So under the MESTEC situation, it was actually, the proposal was, and this went through a lot of rounds of consultation with, including with academics like myself, was that we won't have it as broad as the Singapore law. We just want to take care of our companies, meaning that we want to just have the law liable for Malaysian companies functioning in Indonesia. The reason for this being that we wanted to eliminate the finger pointing that always happened with when Malaysia complains to Indonesia, Indonesia will say, well, actually it's your companies. So our rationale was when we had this law that said that we are taking care of our companies, we're being serious about our companies, then it would open up more diplomatic space to have a more realistic action plan on haze. However, when we had our change of government again, it was shelved. So I think this goes back to the issue about palm oil being a very important economic sector for Malaysia, and Malaysia having such a big role in Indonesia. So it ties up with the national interest. Again, it also ties up with patronage. A lot of these big companies are very, very well connected, very, very powerful in Malaysia. So of course, there was a lot of resistance from the companies as well. So it ties up to all these issues. And I think importantly, it shows that there is still a very big fight going on in the region and in Malaysia itself between the environment and prosperity and development that we still haven't sorted out yet after all these years. So that begs that question. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you very much, Dr. Varkkey. I mean, your answer clearly shows that peatlands is really a regional issue and cannot be solved by one party alone, and collaboration is certainly it. And maybe the second question, this is to Dr. Salmah. This is a question from Shahira Zulfahri, who are asking questions about situation in Batu Pahat River, where there were 4 water intakes at Batu Pahat River no longer, let me look at it again. So the water, because of the issue of 4 water intakes, the water pH is acidic and heavy metals concentrations are high. How can we treat this situation to reuse the water as a source of drinking water? So I assume this is like peatland area. So can you enlighten us on this, Dr. Salmah?
Yeah, as I said, peatland is only part of the river basin. So the pollution need not necessarily come from the peat, because it talk about heavy metals and things like that. It could have come from the whole river basin. So essentially, I think we, as those who are living in river basin, all of us lives in river basin, need to wise up and make sure that we push in to ensure all wastewater are treated. Because I think if it's only pit salt, it's much simpler for water supply.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Salmah. So next, I have a question for Professor Joosten and Professor Page. So maybe the two of you can take this question. So this is from People for Peat. So a recent paper in Nature has suggested that peat compaction can be a viable method in helping trees establish themselves better in peat restoration. And this sentiment is also shared by certain peat researchers in ASEAN. What are the pros and cons of the peat compaction method, and would you recommend it for peatland restoration in Southeast Asia?
Maybe I start.
Yes.
Peat compaction is, of course, a strategy that is widely applied in Sarawak for palm oil plantations. The problem with palm oil plantations is that they easily bend over because of the rapid subsidence. And by compacting the peat beforehand, you reduce the rate of subsidence after you have lowered, of course, the absolute height of the peatland. There are various aspects related to that. First, you have already introduced the subsidence because of the compaction. The emissions do not really increase because the density of the peat increases with the compaction, but there is one advantage, and that is that the compaction also leads to a better capillarity, so that water provision also to the peat layers is a little bit better, so that the emissions could be reduced. But the most important thing from this production point of view is, of course, that you do not stop the emissions, and that you certainly also do not stop the subsidence, you only slow it down. And I always say, if you are running towards the cliff, and that's what you are doing with these coastal peatlands, you will be flooded after a while. If you are running towards the cliff, it is not enough to slow down your speed. You have to stop and turn around. This idea of compaction is, of course, also relevant for the establishment of trees in restoration sites. There, to my opinion, the incidence of fires is a more important reason for problems, but Sue knows much more about that, so I give the word to Sue to talk about compaction for restoration purposes.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Prof. Sue Page, please share your insights.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think it's not something that I would recommend as part of a peatland restoration scheme. As Professor Joosten says, it's something that's done in plantations to increase the economic lifetime of the palm trees, to try to prevent them from subsiding and bending over time period. But in terms of restoration, I think there are much more pressing problems that you have to address than the compaction of the peat surface. In fact, I think in terms of restoration, you don't want that, because actually compaction would imply that you are leveling, you're making the peat surface uniform. And in fact, the natural surface topography of a peatland, whether you're in the boreal zone, the temperate zone, or the tropics, is that there is a natural micro topography. So there are hummocks, small hummocks and small hollows. And that's what you want to reintroduce, because the hummocks are where the tree species will be most successful in terms of their establishment. So it's interesting, actually, because we do see in a few areas where restoration has been allowed to proceed naturally, that you do over time start to see the redevelopment of this hummock hollow topography. So that's absolutely what we want. That's part of the natural functioning, the natural hydrological and eco-hydrological functioning of the peatland. And as Professor Joosten says, you would be better investing your time and energy into other activities, which might be indeed fire prevention. We see far more damage to peatland restoration schemes from fire than we do from trees toppling over.
Got it. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. I don't know, Dr. Salmah, do you want to answer this question as well?
On the consolidation?
Yes, compaction.
Well, it is good for of course to ensure establishment of the crop, because you are actually making it more dense, but it is no way does it stop the peat from being mineralized and oxidized, because the one above the water level just keep oxidizing, and then you have to dig deeper, and it just continue on until you finish the whole peat substrate. So if your focus is to maintain peat, no, it's not. But if your focus is to temporarily establish the crop, yes.
Okay. Okay, I think it's all clear. I think the message from you all is that, I mean, we need to look at the purpose of peat restoration itself, and there are actually far more important issues than trying to avoid the trees from toppling over, and it's temporary also the effect that that it can provide. So I guess let's go back to Dr. Varkkey. This is a question from Aida Hayati over from the Global Environmental Center, or GEC. What is your view on contribution of certification and best management practices guideline that have been proposed under various schemes such as RSPO and then MSPO and ISPO in reducing haze and peatland protection? And I assume that these certification schemes also have their differences also. So Dr. Varkkey, could you share your thoughts on this topic?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Aida. Yeah, so basically all these RSPO, which is a Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil, MSPO being the Malaysian one and ISPO being the Indonesian one, they are all, of course, trying to solve or to address the problem that there's so much palm oil on peat. And there's also so much understanding that it's dangerous to have palm oil on peat, or rather it's not sustainable to have palm oil on peat. So it's trying to address this balance, right? So of course, all of these certifications, their intention is to, as long as possible, allow it to be profitable to continue to have this palm oil on peat, but at the same time trying to do it in a so-called more sustainable way. So that is the challenge. And the thing is that all of these different RSPO, MSPO, ISPO, their regulations, principles are slightly different from each other. So for RSPO, personally, to me, from what I have understood, the RSPO is pretty much a bit better than the national ones. In the sense that the RSPO, they do have a strict cutoff time where companies should not be planting any more new plantings on peat. RSPO also has a requirement that you have to have the drainability assessment after when you want to have a new cycle, because palm oil is a long time, 25 years you can have the same crop. Before you want to plant a new cycle, you must test how many years more do you have before this place gets flooded. So if it's 40 years more, you should not replant anymore. So that's sort of the cutoff point. And also, you have to have the best management practices and all that. So at least RSPO, this kind of stuff, they are not saying, because it wouldn't make much sense to just say stop. I mean, as in like, whatever you have that's planting, just get rid of it and re-wet. They're allowed to finish the cycle, but if it's no longer viable to do it again, you should think about re-wetting and re-establishment of the peatland ecosystem over there. That being said, that's all good. MSPO and ISPO also is trying to do something similar, but they're doing it on a more limited basis, in the sense that they just say that if you have plantations on peat, you should do it in the BMP kind of thing. You have to do it under best management practices. But I think the challenge here is that nobody really knows what best management practices is. It changes according to who you ask. And as we have heard also from all our other speakers, there's a lot of unknowns, and a lot of things are still being discovered now. So what could be considered best maybe 10 years ago may be different next year. So in the discussions that I've had with, for example, MSPO, it's very hard to actually pinpoint what is the best. So it depends on that company justifying and saying, oh, I believe this is the best management practices, and it may not be. So that is the gray areas that I think still exist within these certification systems. But I think at least it is good, especially since like RSPO, they are looking to the future and saying, okay, you have to have a cutoff point, and you have to do all this assessments to make it to basically don't waste the time of the companies. What's the point of you replanting if you can only have it for 5 years before it floods? So I think that's the effort to try and balance the interests of the economy and as well as the environment as well. So I think I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Varkkey. And I think that's also like the message that or sentiment that was shared by other panelists during their presentations about the importance of balancing the trade-offs and how for the management science is also important. So maybe this is a question related to management of peatland. Maybe each of you can answer this. We know that customary communities, indigenous peoples in this region in Southeast Asia, just like what Professor Joosten showed, like in Europe, the communities have been managing peatlands for centuries. So can you explain, based on your research, your experience, how do customary communities in the region manage peatlands? And are there lessons learned that the customary groups can offer for sustainable peatland management in Southeast Asia? So yeah, maybe I'll start with Dr. Salmah first, and then everyone else can respond to that.
I cannot recall any customary community, except the fact that if they are harvesting products from the peat forest, like sago, ramen, or things like that, but it's in a small quantity, not the kind that doing, so essentially, I think we have to decide what we want to do with this peat soil. Do we want to reclaim it for other services that Professor Page was talking, or do you want to retain it for its natural services? And then we have to move from there, because the needs of the management, there's no two things about managing the water management in the peat soil. If you want a better bearing capacity to bring in a lot of products in and out, then you have to drain it. And the deeper you drain it, the faster the subsidence. And it will be not long before you lost all the peat soil. Maybe that's something that others are targeting, because once you lost all the peat soil, then you are on clay soil. But do remember, the clay soil that you are soon going to be on is at a lower level than the surrounding areas. So that's flood problem coming.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Salmah. Maybe Professor Joosten, you can turn to you.
I think if we take the Paris Agreement serious, that we want to limit climate change, which has as a result that we have to stop carbon emissions completely, and that we even have to have net sinks. And then with respect to peatlands, drained peatlands, we have two choices. Either we anyhow have to re-wet them. And then the choice is, do we want to use them productively? Then we have to develop alternative land use options under these wet conditions, paludicultures we call them totally, or you make them into wet wildernesses again, which also provide ecosystem services. In the European Union, where, for example, 3% of the agricultural land is on peatlands. These agricultural lands are responsible for 25% of all emissions. And in the European Union, the discussion is there, such shall we not simply take these 3% out, re-wet them, make them into nice wet wildernesses with their ecosystem services, and increase productivity on these 97%? Isn't that much more easy than developing wet intensive land use options for re-wetted peatlands? That's the question. But there are, of course, huge areas where the peatland area is so, huge and people are living there, that you cannot depopulate these areas, and there you have to find alternative production systems under conditions that minimize subsidence and emissions. That is the challenge. We do not have them all yet. It is in development also, the entire logistics and the technology, like Dr. Zakaria says, that is a challenge. But if we do not manage that, we will all have to make them into wet wildernesses, which is also not from a biodiversity and ecosystem service point of view.
All right, thank you so much. Very clear. Professor Supich, do you want to chime in?
Yes, I mean, I think all the main points have already been covered, but I would just like to just say one word about a word, and this is the word sustainable, because this is a really compromised term when we talk about peatlands. And I think it's quite unfortunate. Obviously, you know, RSPO, for example, was established long before probably we were thinking about the peatland issue specifically, peatland management issue specifically. But when we think about sustainable land uses on peat, as soon as you put in a drainage ditch, as soon as you lose your natural vegetation cover, peat swamp forest, whatever it is, you cannot talk about sustainable, because they are no longer going to be operating as carbon sequestering systems. So I find this is a really a difficult area, and there is no, the only sustainable management of a peatland is to keep the peatland as a peatland, keep it wet, as Professor Joosten says, keep that carbon accumulating machinery there, you know, which is the natural vegetation and the high water levels and so on. Much more probably appropriate to think about responsible management, so that you move from sustainable to responsible. Of course, that's a whole new debate. What is responsible? And I think what we're trying to advocate is that, as Professor Joosten says, we have choices to make. We can convert landscapes back to wet wilderness, wonderful. And those actually, if we can do that, peatlands we know can operate as really important carbon sinks, and that's really important in terms of you know, our climate agreement. But we have to have some sort of gradient to get there in landscapes where there are now so many people expecting to get a livelihood and expecting to get a return. And so that's where I think this idea of what is responsible really comes in. And I really think we have to think about this at a large scale. We have to think about this at a landscape scale. Where is it appropriate to re-wet? Where is it appropriate to have the wilderness? Where is it appropriate maybe to have the polluticulture systems? Where is it appropriate maybe to, as we've shown in the recent paper, to raise the water level as much as you possibly can, and to work within the constraints that that high water table then presents for farmers and so on. And then I think that actually is a fourth option, which is perhaps the most exciting one, and we haven't really explored properly yet, which is, can we stimulate these peatland systems, these wetlands, to become part of these new ideas that we have about carbon capture and storage, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, other ways in which we could actually treat these peatlands as some sort of wet carbon accumulation system, really stimulate the system to accumulate as much carbon as it possibly can within a shorter time period as it possibly can. But again, that's got landscape land use issues, because it would require taking land out of some sort of form of economic use.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Very interesting discussion here, and I hope this can then be followed up by the organizer, by people for peat, maybe in the next symposium. We are actually approaching 5 o'clock, so we will need to wrap up soon. But maybe one last question to all panelists here. So we know that based on the survey that we had at the beginning of the event, a lot of the participants are actually from the universities across the region, and many of them are students, many of them are youth. So maybe just as an expert who has been working on peatland issues for a long time, can each of you share or remind the youth, especially university students, what can they do to help with Well, to use what Professor Page said earlier, responsible peatland management. So maybe we can start from Dr. Varkkey.
Thank you. I think I'll just pick up quickly on what I said previously. We are most affected by haze here in Malaysia and also in Indonesia. But the problem very much is that haze is a seasonal thing. When haze happens, our politicians, our government talk so much about it because we talk about it and we complain about it. But as soon as the haze disappears, nothing actually gets talked about until the next haze season. Very good example. Even though the Mestek minister in the past was very gung-ho about haze, the minute it cleared, she said, oh, thank God, there's no more haze. And then that was pretty much it. So I believe her heart was in the right place, but just the nature of the problem itself is very seasonal. So I believe that we must not be seasonal about things like this. So we should have the push all throughout the year to remind people. And even now, since last year, there was no haze because of COVID slowing everything down. We're not talking about it. So I think it should be continuously an issue in the public agenda. Thank you.
Got it. Very clear. Thank you so much. Dr. Salmah, it's your turn now. What's your message for the youth?
I'm really very much depending on the youth, but they need to know what's happening. The policy is one thing, but does it just remain as policy or is it being implemented? So the youth it is their future that we are trying to sort of shape. They should be more aware of what is going on. In this, I also, I think, echo what Professor Dr. Varkkey is saying. I mean, it's very time dependent on some of the statement, and I think we need the youth to be more aware of this and to push those things.
Thank you so much, Professor Joosten. Your turn.
Yes, I think you have to take a globally responsible stance. So not only think about short time and local interest, but keep the entire overview. You have to think, you have to act, and you have to persist. That is the most important thing. The problems that we are addressing are not simple and can only be solved by really integrated thinking and by persisting.
Very clear, persistence and integrated thinking. Professor Page.
Thank you. Well, I teach modules on climate change, so I feel very responsible for informing, the next generation of activists, the next generation of scientists. And I say to them at the end of my module, I hope they've learnt, and I hope that they will take that information forward and use it in an appropriate way. And as Greta Thunberg says, you are never too small to make a difference. It's very easy to feel that you're just an individual, just a lone person, just a lone voice in the wilderness. And, that's certainly not the case. We've seen that with collective action on climate change. And it largely has come from the youth, the young generation. You can really, really do a huge amount. You have to be informed, yes, and hopefully joining sessions like this is one way to get that information, but then you also need to take action, whether it's, going on climate marches, or whether it's writing to companies and asking them what their policies are, how they can improve their policies and so on, and also writing to your member of parliaments and so on, bringing the agenda up to where it really matters in the political forum and in the economic forum. But being aware is the first step in all of that. And just to finish by saying, as Greta Thunberg has proven, as a 15 or 16-year-old, she has had a huge impact. You can do the same.
Thank you so much for that beautiful message. I'm not going to summarize our discussion today because we are running out of time, but hopefully those beautiful, important reminders, messages from our panelists would move us forward, would remind each and every one of us that we can be part of that collective action for a better environment, better future for all of us. So with that, I'll return the floor to Reuben. Thank you.
Thank you, Satrio, and thanks again to our 4 distinguished panelists. I think it was very clear in terms of the wrapping up. We did hear a lot about the importance of peatlands and a lot of the issues surrounding it. We will be summarizing and sending out the report to everyone. Hopefully that will also support in terms of reviewing and relooking at some of the materials. I for one, have learned quite a bit. Just as a reminder before we close it, again, this is just the first symposia. There's 4 more to come covering different areas, topics. The next one, Symposium 2, is on 17 June, where we'll talk a bit more in terms of peatland fire restoration and management. And just as a final closing, we would like, if it's possible, to just fill in a survey so that we can further improve. Apologies for not being able to attend to answer all the questions. Would have liked to get more of that, but unfortunately, due to time, we couldn't address all of it. I think with that, I would like to close the session, and thanks again to all the panelists and all the participants for attending. It was, I think, a very good session. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Everybody, bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.